I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there at my kitchen door holding a dish towel, staring at the man in the suit who was handing me a legal envelope, and I thought, I need to sit down before my knees give out. I'm 64 years old. I've buried a husband, raised 2 children on a teacher's salary, and kept this house through 3 refinances and a roof that caved in during the winter of 2009. I am not easily shaken, but that envelope shook me. Let me start at the beginning because none of this makes sense unless you understand what the last 11 years of my life looked like. My daughter, my youngest, was 26 when she had her son. She wasn't married. The father was a man she'd known for about 8 months, someone she met at a bar in Charlotte where she was living at the time. He left before the baby was born. She called me crying from the hospital at 2 in the morning, and I drove 4.5 hours without stopping. That was February, cold and dark, sleet on the highway the whole way. I didn't care. That's what mothers do. My grandson was born healthy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Dark eyes, little fists clenched like he was already ready to fight. I held him and something in me just settled. Like I'd been waiting for him without knowing it. His name is Theo. The first year was hard for my daughter. Postpartum hit her badly and I tried to be understanding. I drove up to Charlotte most weekends. I brought food. I helped with laundry. I held Theo while she slept. She was struggling and I told myself that's normal. New mother alone, no support from the father. I gave her grace. But by the time Theo was 18 months old, something felt wrong. Not with him, with her. She was going out more. Leaving Theo with neighbors, sometimes overnight. She'd call me at strange hours, not to talk about the baby but to talk about herself. A new man she'd met, a job opportunity in Atlanta, a friend who had a spare room. Her whole life was opening back up, and Theo was starting to feel like an obstacle to her, not a person. I kept telling myself I was reading it wrong. I wasn't. When Theo was 2.5, a pediatrician flagged some developmental concerns. He wasn't speaking the way most children his age were. He lined things up, toy cars, blocks, spoons, in very specific patterns. He didn't always respond when you called his name. He had very clear preferences about textures and sounds. The doctor referred them to a developmental specialist. My daughter called me after that appointment, and her first words were, "I can't do this." I said, "Do what, honey?" She said, "Any of this." She drove Theo to my house 3 days later, with 2 garbage bags of clothes and collapsible stroller. She said she needed a break, just a couple weeks to get her head together. I said, "Okay." I set up the back bedroom with a toddler mattress on the floor and a nightlight shaped like a moon. 2 weeks became a month. A month became 3. By the time Theo's 3rd birthday came around, I had filed for guardianship, and she had signed the papers without a single argument. She called maybe 4 times that first year, then twice. Then once at Christmas, a voicemail 4 minutes long, mostly about herself. By the time Theo started kindergarten, I hadn't heard from her in 14 months. I want you to understand something. I did not fall apart. I could not afford to. I had a little boy who needed consistency and routine, and someone who would show up every single day no matter what. So I showed up. I retired early from teaching. I had planned to work until 67, but Theo needed more than an after-school program could give him. I drew down my retirement earlier than I wanted to. I learned everything I could. I went to every IEP meeting, every therapy session, every specialist appointment. I learned what overstimulation looked like, what his specific triggers were, what the difference was between a shutdown and a meltdown, and how to help him through each one. It was not easy. There were nights I sat in the hallway outside his room after he finally fell asleep, and I just breathed. That was all I could do. Just breathe. But here's what people don't understand about children like Theo. They don't think differently in a way that's less. They think differently in a way that is entirely their own. Theo at 4 could tell you every make and model of every car in our neighborhood by the sound of the engine. Theo at 6 memorized the bus schedules for the entire city of Greensboro for fun, because he found it interesting. Theo at 8 could spend 6 hours working through a problem that fascinated him and not notice the time passing. His 3rd grade teacher pulled me aside one afternoon and said quietly, like it was almost too big to say out loud, "I've been teaching for 19 years. I've never had a student like him." She didn't mean it as a problem. When Theo was 10, he got interested in coding. I bought him a beginner's book at a used bookstore, more hoping it would hold his attention than expecting anything. Within 2 weeks, he had finished it and was asking me for a second one. I got him 3. Then he found free courses online and taught himself. He would sit at the kitchen table after dinner with his headphones on and just work hours, quiet and focused in a way that he wasn't always in parts of his life. I learned to make sure he had snacks at his elbow and didn't interrupt him unless the house was on fire. By the time he was 12, he was doing things I genuinely did not understand. I would sit next to him sometimes and ask him to explain, and he would patiently, in his careful way that always started from the very beginning. He never assumed I knew something I didn't. That was one of my favorite things about him. He started working on something specific when he was 14. He wouldn't tell me much at first, just that it was an app, that it was for people who had trouble with sensory issues in public places. He'd had a bad experience at a grocery store when he was 11. The lights, the overhead music, the unpredictable sounds of the PA system, and he never forgot it. He wanted to build something that helped people like him plan ahead, know what to expect, prepare. I told him it sounded like a wonderful idea. He nodded and went back to work. I had no idea. He spent 2 years building it. He emailed companies. He talked to occupational therapists at his school who helped him refine what it needed to do. He found a mentor online, a software developer in Seattle, who agreed to guide him after Theo sent him a 14-page document explaining the concept. The developer told me later he'd never received anything like it from an adult, let alone a 15-year-old. The app launched quietly. Theo didn't make a big deal of it. It was just done, and then it was out there. I remember he showed me the download screen and I said, "This is yours. You made this." And he looked at me in his sideways way and said, "Yes." Within 4 months, it had been featured in a disability advocacy newsletter, then a parenting blog, then a piece in a regional newspaper, then, and this is when things started to move fast, a journalist at a national outlet wrote about it, about Theo, about what he'd built and why. The headline called him a teenage innovator. They mentioned his diagnosis. They mentioned that he was being raised by his grandmother. They did not mention my daughter. I don't know how she found out. I imagine she has Google alerts, or someone sent her the article, or she just stumbled across it the way things find their way to you when you've been avoiding them long enough. But she found out. The first contact came through a lawyer's letter. That's what was in the envelope the man in the suit handed me at my kitchen door. A letter from an attorney's office in Atlanta stating that my daughter, named as Theo's biological mother, was seeking to assert her parental rights and establish legal standing with regard to any financial interests accruing to her minor child. I had to read it 3 times. She wasn't asking to see her son. She wasn't asking how he was doing, whether he was happy, what his favorite food was, whether he still lined up his sneakers by color at the front door every night before bed. She was asking about his money. I sat down at the kitchen table. Theo was at school. I put the letter down and I looked at the window, and outside the maple tree in the yard was just starting to turn red the way it does every October, and I thought, okay, we are going to have to fight. I called a family law attorney that same afternoon. Her name was Ms. Osei. Sharp woman, practiced in Guilford County for 20 years, didn't waste words. She read the letter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is not unusual when a child with a disability has a financial breakthrough. I've seen it before. The parent who is absent suddenly becomes very present." I said, "What are our chances?" She was quiet again. Then she said, "It depends on what documentation you have. 11 years is a long time. How thorough are your records?" I almost laughed. I'm a retired school teacher. My records were immaculate. I had every medical appointment, every IEP meeting, every therapy note, every school communication. I had the guardianship papers, obviously, but I also had more than that. I had grocery receipts, prescription records, the notes I kept in a spiral notebook that I started when Theo was 3, because a social worker had suggested it and I never stopped. I had 11 years of that boy's life documented in a way that told a story no lawyer could argue with. But Ms. Osei was still careful. She said my daughter's attorney would try to make the case that parental rights don't simply evaporate because of absence, that Theo was still a minor, and that as his biological mother she had a legal claim to be involved in decisions about his welfare and, potentially, his finances. She could win something, Ms. Osei said. "I want to be honest with you. I don't think she'll get what she's after, but I can't promise you clean hands on the other side." I went home and I didn't sleep much that night. What I did not do, and I want to be clear about this, was tell Theo right away. He was 16. He wasn't in the middle of something important. The app had started generating real revenue. A nonprofit had approached him about licensing it for a sensory-friendly community mapping project. There were conversations happening with people who took him seriously, who saw what he'd built for exactly what it was. I was not going to drop this in the middle of that. I waited 2 weeks. Then one evening after dinner, when he was sitting at the table with his laptop and a glass of orange juice, he went through a phase where he drank orange juice every night, exactly 8 ounces, in the same blue cup. I sat down across from him and I told him. I expected him to get upset. He didn't. He closed the laptop. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "How long has she been gone?" I said, 11 years. He nodded slowly like he was filing that number somewhere precise and permanent. Then he looked at me and he said, "I've been keeping records too." I didn't know what that meant. Not fully. Not yet. The legal process moved slowly through the fall. My daughter's attorney filed a motion asserting her parental rights. Ms. O.C. filed our response, attaching summaries of the documentation I'd provided. There was a hearing scheduled for December. I went to every appointment with a folder of papers and a very still face. My daughter did not come to any of the preliminary hearings. She sent her lawyer. In October, I received a phone call. Not from the attorney's office, but from my daughter herself. The first time I'd heard her voice in almost 4 years. She sounded careful, rehearsed. She said she knew she hadn't been there. She said she'd struggled. She said she was in a better place now. She said she just wanted a chance. I listened. I did not interrupt. When she was done, I said, "Theo is 16. If he wants to have a relationship with you, that will be his choice to make, not mine and not yours. But I will tell you plainly, this lawsuit is not going to give you what you think it's going to give you." She said, "I just want to be part of his life." I said, "Then you should have started with a phone call, not a lawyer." She hung up. The hearing was on a Thursday, in December, gray and cold. Ms. Ose and I arrived early. My daughter came in with her attorney, and I saw her for the first time in years cross a courtroom. She looked like herself and also not. Older. A little thin. Who? She didn't look at me. His attorney made his arguments. She had never formally terminated her parental rights. She had been going through a mental health crisis that was now addressed and managed. She had sought help. She had stabilized. As the biological mother of a minor child generating significant income, she had a legitimate interest in his welfare and in the oversight of his finances. Ms. O.C. laid out our case quietly and completely. 11 years. Every document, the guardianship, the therapy appointments, the school records, the medical records, the notebook I'd kept since he was 3, now filling 7 volumes. Then something happened that I had not anticipated. Theo had asked to submit a statement. Ms. O.C. had told me about it 2 days before the hearing. She said he'd come to her office by himself. He'd taken the bus, which he was completely capable of doing, and he'd handed her a written statement, 3 pages typed and printed. He wanted it entered into the record. The judge read it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she read aloud from part of it, just a sentence, and I will not forget it as long as I live. Theo had written, "I am not a financial asset. I am a person who has been raised with love and consistency by one person for my entire conscious life, and I am asking this court to recognize that disrupting that stability serves no one, least of all me." His words, 16 years old. The judge set down the papers. She looked at my daughter's attorney. She asked one question. "What evidence does your client have of any relationship with this child in the last 11 years? The attorney had no answer. The motion was denied. My daughter's attempt to establish financial oversight over Theo's earnings was rejected. The court affirmed my guardianship. It noted that Theo himself had expressed clearly and in writing his own understanding of his situation, and that the court found no basis on which disrupting the existing arrangement would serve his best interests. We walked out into the cold December air and I stood on the courthouse steps, and I finally let myself breathe. Ms. O.C. squeezed my arm. I called Theo. He answered on the second ring. I said, "It's done. We won," he said. "I know." I calculated the probability at around 91%. I laughed. I actually laughed, standing on those steps in the cold. I said, "You calculated it." He said, "Based on the documentation. The math was in our favor." I drove home and I sat in my kitchen and I looked at the maple tree, bare now, just sticks and gray sky behind it. I thought about the day I drove 4.5 hours in the sleet to a hospital in Charlotte to hold a baby I hadn't known I needed. I thought about all the nights in between, all the IEP meetings, all the grocery store trips where we had to leave early because the fluorescent lights were too much. All the mornings I made his breakfast exactly the same way because that was what helped him start the day. People ask me sometimes, usually women my age at church or at the grocery store, people who know a little bit of my daughter. They ask me if I'm angry when they ask. And the truth is complicated. I am angry at what she did. Abandoning a child is not something I will ever be able to make peace with, not fully. Especially a child who needed more, not less. Especially when she walked away with the full knowledge that he was going to need things she didn't want to provide. But I also know she was sick in the way that people can be sick in their minds and their hearts, sick in ways that don't show up on any scan. I don't know what she's carrying. I never fully knew. What I know is this: I chose Theo. Every single day I chose him. Not because I had to. Not because there was no other option. Because he was mine and I was his, and that was enough reason. He is 17 now. The app has partnerships with two major hospital networks, a school district in Ohio, and a sensory-friendly travel company that reached out to him last spring. He is talking to colleges. Not because I pushed him, but because there are two programs he researched himself that he wants to be part of. He has a small group of friends he met through an online community for developers his age. He goes to bed at the same time every night and keeps his sneakers lined up by color at the front door and drinks his orange juice in his blue cup. And these things are not quirks to manage, they are him. And I love every single one of them. My daughter has not contacted us since December. I don't know what her life looks like now. I hope she finds some peace. I genuinely do. But that hope doesn't change anything about what happened, and it doesn't have to. Last month, Theo came downstairs on a Saturday morning while I was making coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table and he said, without any preamble, the way he often says important things, "I want you to know I understand what you gave up." For me, I've been thinking about it. I poured my coffee. I sat down across from him. I said, "You don't owe me anything for that." He looked at me in his steady way, and he said, "I know. I'm not saying it as a debt. I'm saying it because I know, and I wanted you to know that I know." I didn't cry then either, but it was close.